Right, William, you with me?
I am sorry I'm late. Okay, awesome. We've got the video as well. Fantastic.
I was just saying, Will, this is such a rare occurrence that both of us end up doing one of these for
Right,
a
we're
long
both
time.
doing it. Yeah, it's been definitely a number of months since the last time.
Very excited. It's like the dream team's back together.
And it's a good topic as well. A very pressing topic, I think, at the moment in particular. So it's a nice one to be going
Yeah,
through.
like dream team, right? Okay. All right, so we'll kick us off. So today, it is me and Will. So, Will, do you want to introduce yourself to everyone?
I will. I will. Hi everyone. Thanks for coming along today. My name is Will. I'm the head of consulting at UniAdmissions. My background is I studied psychology at Oxford, and since then have been making sure that our consulting team knows absolutely everything to do with the application process and is able to, give the best advice we can whenever you get in touch with us. Rohan.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Dr. Rohan Agarwal. I'm the founder of the UniAdmissions. I started this 7 years ago, and essentially the best part of my role is speaking to parents and students and really helping them make decisions to boost their application chance successes. This is when I get to speak to lots of parents at the same time, which is always really fun. And we sometimes get some very interesting and obtuse questions. So your challenge audience today is to try and catch Will and I out. We'll of course do our best to get through all of them. Very rarely are there things that we can't answer. Sometimes there are questions that I guess we just need a bit more time on. So if we kind of ask you to book in a slot with us, it's not as kind of deferring. It's just literally we'd need 3 or 4 monitors and be cross-checking 4 or 5 spreadsheets in order to get the information.
Rohan, we've got a couple people are saying that the audio is too low. I can hear you fine, but I don't know if that's a common problem.
If you want to just carry on, Will, and I'll members of the audience, is this just audio from Will, or is it from me, or is it from both of us?
I'm just saying that I've seen a couple of things in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just looking at those as well.
Okay, we've got some people saying that it's okay. For those of you who are struggling to hear, maybe try a different set of headphones or try on a different device. That might fix things. Sorry, I'm afraid you're in the minority. We've got a flurry of people who can hear us just okay. But yeah, we'll carry on. It's worth saying as well, there is going to be, like Rohan was saying, we'll be answering lots of questions at the end. As we go through our presentation at the start, though, please do drop questions in the Q&A. We are ignoring them, but we will get back to them. So if we say something which triggers a question in your head, jot it down. Otherwise, if you try and hold on to it for an hour, you might forget it.
Absolutely. So this week's topic is really just choosing medical schools. And the next week we're going to be talking about the kind of fabled interview process, how to prepare and ensure that you come out on top. But this week is a much more interesting topic in the sense that there's no right and wrong answer, like the interviews when generally tend to be. So this is really what we're all about, which is competition for medical schools increases pretty much every year. If you look at the stats, pretty much the ratio of places versus those accepted continues to increase. So last year was probably the biggest. Well, I think it was the biggest in terms of entry for medical schools. So even though we've had a few new medical schools open up, the new places added was still eclipsed by the extra number of applicants. Often ask me at this point why, and I mean you just have to look around kind of the world. So when there's a war, everyone wants to be a soldier. When there's a pandemic, everyone wants to be a doctor or a nurse, I suppose. So Will, it's normally me who does this, but I'm going to give you the great honor of
take over. Yeah, absolutely. So obviously what we're thinking about is the application, and we're thinking about it in the context of choosing a medical school. So ultimately what we do when we crunch the numbers, we look at application statistics, we go through student data, we see what things correlate with getting offers and what things seem to be more important than others. And we break it down into this pie chart here. So you can see that in the orange, you've got your admissions test, so your Ucat or your Bmat. In the grey, you've got the interview. In the blue, you've got your exam grades, so your GCSEs and your predicted grades, and then yellow, everything else. That encompasses your personal statement, your school's reference letter, your SAQ if you're applying to Cambridge, various other bits and pieces that don't fall nicely into the three main categories of test interview grades. Now, that's a pretty good heuristic, that's a pretty good rule of thumb to use, particularly for Oxford and Cambridge. But when we go across all the different medical schools, what's really important is to be aware that they don't all follow the same pattern. Okay, so at Oxford and Cambridge, the admissions test and the interview is hugely important. The majority actually of the difference between students is found in those parts of the application. So most students applying have very good grades, have a pretty well written personal statement. There's not really much that separates students at that point, so it's not used as heavily. Whereas for the tests and the interviews, that is really where they can determine, okay, who is the top of this cohort and who isn't, basically. But I've told you that it's not always this way, which of course is not very helpful. But I'll give you a bit of a sense as to how it can change. And broadly, one of the things that we see vary is when you're coming to interview, where that emphasis is put between the test or the grades. So certain medical schools will care a lot more about the grades than they do about the test. And actually, a poor score on the test doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world for an application to that university. On the other hand, there are some medical schools which it's the other way around. So they care a lot about that test score and much less on the grade. So if you've got poorer grades than what you'd like, that's not necessarily a limiting factor on an application there. And we'll talk about this a lot more through the rest of this open day. But one of the key things, in order to be able to know what, how to make a decision, you need to first know how they are making their decision, how each medical school you're applying to is going to be evaluating you, and then playing towards your strengths. So if you know that you've got good grades, then you might want to play towards that. If you know that you've not got the best grades, then actually the Ucat, the Bmat, really important. And you're going to need to pull all the stops basically to make sure that you do very well there. It does vary a bit from subject to subject, but we're talking about medical schools, we're talking about medicine, so I won't go into that in much detail today. Anyone who's come to these before will have seen this, but not in the context of broader medical schools. Hopefully that gives a good summary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the other complexity, which I'm sure we'll come on to, is that for medicine, you actually have two lifelines. So with some tests, if you're applying for, say, medicine for Cambridge, you have to do the BMAT. Whereas, if you apply for economics at Cambridge, for instance, you only have to do the ECA and you don't have another choice. Whereas if you're applying for medical schools, you can actually take two different tests, and the way you interpret and use the results has a big impact on which medical schools you apply to ultimately and get into. But more on that later. So, Will, often people say, well, what are my chances? How do I get started? What does, we've put here very unhelpfully, very good GCSEs. What does that actually translate to?
So to give you some very hard numbers, the average number of A stars at GCSE for an Oxford medic is 10.2. For a successful Oxford medic who's got their offer. For Cambridge, it's 9. So, those
and the key word there, Will, is successful, right? Well,
okay, yeah. So average as successful. So generally, the overall applicant pool is usually a few A stars below the average successful person. So if those are universities that you're thinking about applying to, then you will have your GCSEs. Most of you are applying this year, so you've got your GCSE grades, and you'll be able to think, how does that stand in comparison to the average offer holder, because we don't want to be comparing to the average applicant. We want to be aiming to be an offer holder, hopefully. And if you're a bit below, then you know, okay, so if we go back to that pie chart, in that first chunk, that grades chunk, I'm a bit below the average. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means you need to be a bit above, or maybe quite a lot above the average elsewhere. Okay, so it's helpful to have that comparison. But a lot of you will be non-Oxbridge, might just be applying to medical schools in London, across the rest of the UK. You might not be thinking of applying to Oxford or Cambridge, and you might be wondering, well, how stringent are the GCSE, or how high are the GCSE performances there? And it does vary quite a lot. And unsurprisingly, it varies depending on if your medical school is one of those ones which cares a lot about the GCSEs or not. What we see is that at the London medical schools, the GCSE performances are still pretty high. So not too far from what it is for Oxford or Cambridge. But outside of London and outside some of the, the most competitive medical schools, that the GCSE performance can range. It's worth bearing in mind that there are some clear sort of no quibble GCSE requirements for certain medical schools. Most of them will require that you have English and maths at a 6 or higher. So some of them, the requirement will be lower, but that's quite a common one. If you're worried about that, if that makes you think, oh, I need to double check that, then there will be medical schools. There's a few which require 4 maths and English or higher. But of course, you want to know that now, rather than after you've made your applications. And this is what this open day is really all about, helping everyone make sure that they're making these decisions and realizing these things now, rather than once it's too late and you have to try through Ucats extra, but that's a huge extra piece of work that you don't really want to be doing.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out there were pretty much 0 places available in clearing for medicine this year, and then based on what's been happening, it's likely the same will be true the next year as well. So there was one fabled year when there were about 100 places available, but medicine is very competitive. There are pretty much no spaces left, so you only have 4 shots at it. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Right. So moving on to A levels. So hopefully everyone in this webinar is taking, or their child is taking chemistry at A level. If not, you probably have a big problem which you need to discuss. So chemistry is the one essential A level that is absolutely paramount for pretty much every single medical school in the UK. There are some medical schools which will consider you without chemistry, but they tend to be from the private sector and they tend to have their own separate entry requirements. For the purpose of this webinar, they're pretty much going to stay on topic for, well, the 95% other that do require chemistry. Biology is actually, people think it may be essential, but it's not. You can get into medical school without biology. In fact, I had some friends at Cambridge a few friends at Cambridge who actually had places there and were studying medicine without having taken biology A level. But typically, most medical schools prefer you having biology, chemistry, and another STEM subject like maths, further maths, physics. There are exceptions. For example, UCL tend to prefer students who are applying with at least one humanities subject, whether that be history, geography, English, and so on. But generally, the more sciences subjects that you present as your top 3, the better. Now, you'll notice a very, very slyly written 3+ here. That 3+, one of the questions that we often get asked, Will, is should I take 4 or 5 A levels? What do you say to that?
So it's usually quite a long-winded answer, and it's usually an answer which revolves around effectively your workload. Because you might think that doing another A level makes you potentially 30% stronger. If you initially had 3, you've added another one, 25 to 30% stronger because of that extra A level. But in reality, it doesn't make that significant a difference. There are some subjects where it does. So we see economics, for example, really important one to have further maths, but actually for medicine, it doesn't seem to make an enormous difference. And the reason why I say it's a matter of time commitment is if a student comes and tells me, I'm getting 3 A stars in my 3 A levels. If I took on another A level, I'd get an A star, wouldn't be a problem. I'd still be able to do as much work on the UCAT and Bmat as I would without it. It would have no impact on anything else in my application. Then fine, why not? There's no harm in it. But if doing that whole extra A level means that you're spending less time on your chemistry, less time on your maths, and it means that you might not get an A star there, or it means you can't prepare as much for your Ucat or your Bmat. Then actually the negligible benefit of it is quite quickly undone, basically. So it might, most people think, well, an extra A level, surely that's a good thing, but it's not necessarily. Needs to be really well thought through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing is, I think people, very, very short sentence summary of what you just said is, if you're going to get 4 A stars, then take the 4th A level, if you can guarantee that. If there's a remote chance that you'll end up with 2 A stars and 2 A's, then just take 3 A levels, because most medical schools, barring a few specific colleges like Cambridge and Oxford, won't ask for a 4th A level. Imperial is sometimes can ask for the 4th A level as well. Okay, so I mean, the GCSEs and A levels are important, but we'll probably have some questions on how COVID has changed things, and I guess it's probably worth us flicking back to the old pie chart to kind of talk about the impact of GCSEs. So given that GCSEs have essentially been predicted and teacher assessed grades were used for last year's cohorts, how does that impact? Because if I'm a medical school admissions officer, I can't really trust the GCSEs as much as if students had actually set them. So am I going to look at the interview more? Am I going to look at the GCSEs the same way? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is a really important point, and actually, it remains to be seen exactly how it will work. But this cohort is unlike, pretty much everything these admissions tutors will have seen their whole life. They only have one standardized test to judge all their applicants on, and that's either the Ucat or the Bmat. They no longer have the GCSEs where everyone is, sitting a standardized test. It's all, you're right, you can't rely on them. Generally, they say that predicted grades are wrong about 80% of the time, so you can't rely on that either. So you're left with this test, and that's why actually. So before this year, that blue chunk was slightly bigger. We used to put it at around 30%. Now we're dropping it down to 25%. It could be that it's even less important this year. It's difficult to tell exactly, but the admissions tutors have a problem at the moment, in that they can't rely on the GCSEs as much as they once did. Yeah,
and actually, one of my friends is actually a good admissions tutor at one of the medical schools, and he actually said that they would, to a certain extent, they were having to make it up because of how quickly things were developing. That even they didn't know the exact algorithm they would be using last season until it was almost, they had to use it at one point. So they couldn't even tell applicants so sometimes we aren't able to give you that clarity. It's not because we don't know. It's also because, well, the university is also figuring out as they go along, because as Will said, these are uncharted waters for pretty much most scenarios like this. But it kind of hopefully illustrates the point that GCSEs and A levels are less important than the admissions tests and interviews, which is what we try and obviously hammer home. Now, work experience is similarly affected by COVID. So if we were doing this a couple of years ago, the standard advice would have been you need one week in primary care and 1 week in secondary care. So primary care is essentially a GP community setting. A week in secondary care, so hospital or a tertiary centre, referral centre, is generally more than enough. You can get by with far less, and that would have been basically the end of the advice. Would just be go out, speak to lots of hospitals, GPs, get yourself in. Based on what's been happening, pretty much no medical hospitals or GPs are having any work experience students. It's just not worth the risk to them. So instead, the Medical Schools Council, the MSc, has come out. Firstly, they said actually they don't expect work experience to be taking place in person. Secondly, they generated and released a online medical schools work experience course. So if you've not been to that, I would definitely recommend attending. It's free, and you get a little certificate for your portfolio as well. So nowadays, work experience tends to be tailored around essentially not how much time you've done, but what you can learn from your visibility. The whole point of work experience, even before COVID, was to demonstrate a commitment to the profession and to show that you understand what it's like to be getting into the profession. You're not just doing it because your parents are pressuring you into it, or because you think it looks cool, or you have delusional idea that you'll be solving problems like a house. It just doesn't happen these days. Work experience is there to show that you understand that you're giving your life to this profession and to the NHS. Okay, so hopefully anything else to add on work experience, Will?
Well, I was just going to say, you know, again, in the context of thinking about different medical schools, there is, I think I read that Liverpool now say it on their website that they don't look at your personal statements when they're selecting you for interview. So even if you are worried about work experience or anything like that, which you don't really need to be, that might even be a one where if you felt like you had less to talk about yourself, but you've got good grades and you can do well in the Ucats, then again that's a good option to go for. So yeah, if any of these bullet points you're thinking I'm not doing as well as I'd like on that, there's going to be a medical school that you can pivot towards to make it work. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's the beauty about medical schools, because you have so many to pick from. There will be one, even if you bombed your UCAT, you're not keen on trying the Bmat, but you have to, even you know, regardless of which what score you got on your UCAT, what GCSEs you achieve, as long as you satisfy the minimum entry requirements, there is a medical school out there that will accept you, at least on paper. And that's really the beauty of being able to pick a correct medical school. Okay, and obviously, as Will's mentioned, you need to be having stellar A levels. There are a few very select medical schools that will take you with 2 A's and a B in A levels, but pretty much all of them now expect at least 3 A's. Some will accept even higher, expect even higher. So they, for example, if you're thinking about Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial, it's not uncommon for them to ask for up to 2 A stars, depending on the college you're applying to.
Yeah. And it is, if you are on AAB, your options are particularly limited because some of those offering AAB are, again, private sector universities, which for a lot of people, it's just sort of out of the question with the fees.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about UCAT and Bmat quite a bit. So I suppose we'll come back to those, what grade score means. But as we've mentioned, you definitely need chemistry for A levels. You generally need a second STEM subject, and you don't need a third STEM, but generally tends to help. We've kind of, look at us, we're so pros, we're covering all of it. Didn't even need any prompts. Okay, so now this is the kind of juicy bit, which is the admissions test. So, Will, how do you, for those, I mean, hopefully people coming along will have a general understanding of these tests, but imagine this, we have got a few people applying for 2022 and 23 entry. How would you explain the differences between these two tests? Because sometimes parents can get quite confused.
Yeah. So I was going to say, if we're, for those applying for 2022, if you don't yet know what the UCAT or Bmat is, you've got a lot of catching up to do. Yeah. Given that we've got about 20 days left to be able to sit the UCAT. But for people who've never heard of this, they're very new to it. In order to explain the UCAT, I sort of explain it as like an 11 plus. Testing those kind of verbal reasoning, spatial reasoning skills, except if you were doing the 11 plus and you had a fraction of the time to do it in, and you also had to then make some ethical decisions at the end, which is ultimately, I think, a pretty good summary. There are 5 sections to the test, so verbal reasoning, decision-making, abstract reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and your SJT. And obviously just saying those words means nothing to most people, but a hyped up 11 plus with very little time to do it in is a pretty good analog. The Bmat does test your science. The UCAT doesn't at all, which sometimes people are quite surprised by. They say, well, why aren't they testing my science? But actually, a lot of medical schools have decided that we don't need to test that as part of our application process above and beyond what we see in your grades. So in the Bmat, you are going to be tested across all the sciences, including physics, even though most people won't have even thought about physics for a year or so. And you have to write an essay as well. And the first section is sort of a bit 11 plus, a bit critical thinking-y. So they are slightly different. And as Rohan was saying earlier, there might be one that you feel is more suited to what you can achieve. Now, what students will often do is right at the start of their application, sit both and see, have a practice paper of both and see how it goes, or try some practice questions. And naturally, you're not going to, be getting 99% right in one and not in the other, and then sort of chuck one, but you might have a sense of which you can get a better feel for. However, overall, the advice that we give is to prepare for both, because what you don't want to do is end up sitting your UCAT near the end of September, it not go to plan, and then have nothing left in the tank to be able to pivot over to a Bmat if you need to.
Yeah, and hopefully you've been following our sagely wisdom over the last few months, and you've already taken your UCAT and you've got 3,000 or above, and happy days, just move on to the Bmat. But if you haven't taken your UCAT already, it's really, really important you get that out of the way quickly, because the first term is very, very, of year 13 is very, very time pressured. And if you're hoping to take the Bmat, you'll need at least a clear run of a couple of months for it. So ideally, we like to get students taking their UCAT early, mid-August, mid to late August, before they come back to school, and then they crack on with the Bmat from there onwards. Yeah, I've not really thought of the UCAT as a 11 plus on steroids with some ethical decision making at the end. That sounds quite scary when you put it that way.
Yeah, I think it gets people to take it seriously, which is important. A lot of students that I speak to who have already been through the process and haven't been successful will then sort of come back to us, and they've done it on their own one time, they didn't manage it, and they need some advice, and they'll say, I read online that you could prepare in 2 weeks, or I only needed to start 4 weeks in advance of the test, and I thought that would be enough, and inevitably they don't end up doing as well as they'd like to, and ultimately I want students to take these tests seriously, because they are very important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think 5 years ago, when I was doing and having conversations with parents, there would often be a case of they would try and take the test, and often I would have to say, look, you need to spend at least 4 to 8 to 12 months kind of preparing for this intensively, so on and so on, depending on their ability. And there'd be a bit of reluctance, because they would just say, well, I'll just turn up, it's a psychometric, it's an IQ test, you can't prepare for an IQ test.
Yeah.
And the UCAT consortium themselves used to say, you can't prepare for the UCAT. And interestingly, over the last couple of years in particular, we have so many parents coming to us saying, we need extra help, we need this, to the extent where I think that even the UCAT consortium recently have taken off that statement from their website, which used to be, you cannot prepare for the UCAT. Now it's targeted preparation may result in improvements to your UCAT score, which is exactly what we do.
Yeah.
So there's definitely been a change in mindset, and obviously that's a kind of function of the amount of resources available. So it's one of those that just because you're doing the textbook doesn't mean you're ahead of the competition, because everyone's doing that textbook as well. And yeah, the key point here that I think we've obviously implicitly implied is each university is only going to use one. So no university will ask for a combination of the UCAT and Bmat.
Yeah.
That's actually very important tactically, because if you've done particularly well in the UCAT, but not very well in the Bmat, then, or you think you won't perform well in the Bmat, then you can change your choices accordingly, and vice versa. Okay, so we're going to move on to a little bit about the Bmat. I think Will's pretty much covered a lot of this already. The other main thing here to mention is, like last year, the Bmat will take place online again. And same as last year, there's only one sitting. I think it's either the 3rd or 4th November. It's probably the 3rd November this year. The impact of that is, it's important that when you are doing past papers with Bmat and generally papers, you do them online through an online portal. The one that was used last year wasn't particularly successful from the Bmat consortium's perspective. There were a lot of
I'd forgotten about that. That was a car crash.
Yeah, I think I was being quite polite. Yeah, it did not go well. So I'm hoping they'll have a different supplier to kind of administer the test. I think it's fair to say about 25 to 40% of people, based on the kind of samples we did of 1,000, were affected. So serious issues. The main thing to say about the Bmat is actually, even more so than the UCAT, it is not just a test of knowledge, it's also an application of knowledge. And so unlike the UCAT, it's more an exam technique, and there's no kind of dedicated syllabus. With the Bmat, there literally is a syllabus. It's a 300-page book, depending on how much you remember. But the important thing is it's all there, and it, if you don't prepare properly for the BMAT, it's essentially completely down to you, because unlike the UK where you could be unlucky on the day, BMAT you will get found out very quickly if you fail to prepare, because it is a test of knowledge and it's a test of application of knowledge as opposed to a psychometric test. So this is particularly relevant, for example, with students who haven't done physics, like Will said. So if you don't know, if you can't recite 5 equations right now that link voltage and current together, then you need to go home and do your basic Ohm's law and velocity and all of these kind of electrical equations, and make sure you have a formula sheet. If you don't have those kind of things at the back of your mind, then the BMAT becomes much, much harder as a result. Okay. So, Will, obviously we've talked a little bit about the UCAT itself. How does one go about preparing for these tests in general before we kind of move on?
Yeah, so there's obviously lots of different ways to approach something like this. The first thing is to give yourself more time than you think you need. However you're going to approach it. Some students are in our programs and we're supporting them. Some students are going about it on their own, but either way, always give yourself more time than you think, because time flies by when you're having fun doing UCAT past papers. But it's what you want to be doing in the way that you prepare is combined efforts of both lots and lots of practice, cannot stress the importance of practice, as well as targeted focus on the areas that you're struggling with. So usually it's very difficult to do that without a tutor to guide you and to help explain when you've got things wrong. But really focusing in on the areas where you're scoring the lowest is how you're going to end up scoring the highest overall. One thing that students always do, I was exactly the same, is you keep repeating the stuff that you're very good at and give the stuff that you're less good at much less attention. That is a complete wrong way to go about it, because that is going to bring you down at the end. Yes,
psychologically it's the same, isn't it? I mean, we see so many students stressing about their personal statements, and when I kind of tell them, actually, you pretty much won't. There's this conception that if you write a really good personal statement, that'll get you the offer at your medical school. And then when I tell people, actually, some admissions tutors don't read it, they don't believe me, and then I have to tell them, actually, I was in the room with admissions tutors and I interviewed people at Cambridge and we did not read personal statements. Yeah. And then they're shocked. So it's just, as you said, Will, it's about working on the right areas at the right time rather than working on the areas that you're already good at, because there's law of diminishing returns essentially at that point. Okay. So if we move on to how do we actually go about choosing, now that we've kind of caught everyone up and everyone's on the same page, the first thing to say is you only have 4 choices. So if you're not already aware, pretty much all of the subjects you can apply for 5 subjects, 5 university places. For medicine, it's a little bit harder. You only have 4 choices. So essentially all 4 have to be somewhere that you can get in. Don't try and have a stretch goal. What I mean by that is if you're only predicted 3 A's and you know that you'll struggle to get any more than 3 A's, don't apply to a university that requests 2 A stars and an A. It's just a complete waste of your time. Avoid putting your eggs into one basket. So this is what we were talking about. This is why we recommend to all students who enroll with us, we essentially make them take both UCAT and BMAT. Sometimes they don't like it, but actually it's a surefire way of getting in, ensuring that they actually get a place at a medical school. So whilst it's all well and good being able to go to a top tier university like Imperial, UCL, Cambridge, G5 as they call them, the kind of reality, Will, is if you go to any medical school in the UK, you will end up as a doctor in 5 to 6 years' time. Yeah. What we don't want is students working with us who don't at least have a place at a medical school, because ultimately it'd be great if you get into Oxbridge, but even if you don't, at least you have a place and you're going to be a doctor rather than having to take a year out.
Yeah, and I think in the conversations where I'm trying to sort of get this across to people, often the rebuttal is, well, I'm giving myself a lot more work if I do both tests. And this is a very strange argument to me, because actually you're giving yourself a hell of a lot of work wanting to be a doctor and wanting to go to medical school. So if a lot of work now is something which is sort of causing you concern, then that's the kind of time where I worry, okay, is this actually something that you should be doing? Because if you know that doing both tests gives you a better chance of being a doctor, and being a doctor is what you want to be, it should be a no-brainer.
Yeah. Me and Will are not very sympathetic to people who don't want to work very hard, given that I think I used to spend about 12, 14 days in a library during my exam terms. So unless you're working 14 days, working hard to us.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you can often come into this academic year, your year 12, your year 13, with lots of other things that you're doing. You know, and I might speak to a student and they say, well, I am very busy because I'm doing X on Monday, Y on Tuesday, Z on Wednesday, and then repeat it. But ultimately, you know, is X, Y, and Z going to help you be a doctor? In most cases, no. So actually, it might be that you have to put that on pause for a little while and get this done, and sort of, you know, sort that out first, and then come back to it. And again, it's all about how much you want to be a doctor. If you really want to be a doctor, a step away from the piano lessons for a year, if it means you getting a place.
Yeah, the piano lesson is a really interesting one, because I had a very, very difficult conversation with a parent and child recently, where they were convinced that because she was able to do her grade 8 piano, that she could demonstrate manual dexterity and therefore would be an amazing surgeon. When I kind of explained that, you know, I'd worked in surgery, and the last thing we asked someone is, do you have grade 8 piano? She was not happy. But, you know, those are the kind of difficult conversations we need to have, because ultimately what we don't want is people spending, as you said, Will, 10 plus hours a week on getting their grade 8 piano, which is obviously very important, but it's much better you do that once you've got your place in medical school confirmed, rather than having to do it at the same time. So if you're serious about your application, you know, I think that comes first and foremost before anything else. Yes, especially if you're coming spending months and months on UCAT BMAT prep, then you will have to make up for that time, because there have been students, including our students, who have been working for, well, some of them have been working since year 10 for this kind of test. So before we move on, one thing I do want to mention, just as a general tip, which kind of some people find really helpful, is for those of you working towards 2023 entry, it's generally actually a really good idea. So a pro tip is to take the UCAT a year early in your year 11, essentially, sorry, year 12. So if you've just gone into year 12, I'd really recommend taking the UCAT and just seeing how you do. Now, one of two things will happen. Either you'll do amazingly well, which is great, because then essentially you focus on other areas of your application, or the more likelihood, based on my experiences, is you'll do pretty terribly. And actually that tends to be a bigger wake-up call, and then suddenly students that we work with find themselves motivated to work harder, because they know that their baseline is X, so it's 550, 750 in order to get into their medical school of dream. So that's just a very quick tip. And again, if your school allows you to do the same for the BMAT, I'd highly encourage you to do so as well. Okay, so yes, BMAT, it just makes complete sense. You should do both. It diversifies your risk and essentially makes a lot more options available to you. This is particularly important if you've not got a very good UCAT score. It's really, really important you take the BMAT. We speak to so many students who say, oh, I didn't do very well in the UCAT. What are my options? And we say, take the BMAT. But then they say, no, I don't want to. And then we say, okay, do you want to go to medical school or not? And again, it's not us trying to be mean, but our job is to help parents make informed decisions so that they get into medical school. Okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit of tactics on how to apply and which universities to be kind of really picking. So let's say, Will, you're doing chemistry, physics, and maths at A-level. You're pretty confident, relaxed, under pressure, straight A student, got 9s at GCSEs, A-star A predicted. What do you think of these 4 choices? Cambridge, UCL, King's, Imperial? I mean, this person clearly doesn't want to leave the confines of the M25, right?
Yeah. They've got a very clear idea of where they want to study. Ultimately, you know, this is something that we will see quite a lot. One thing that's of course important to remember is that you get your UCAT grade before you make your application, whereas this year you won't with your BMAT. So 3 of those options are BMAT universities. And if the BMAT doesn't go to plan, as you know, even with the best preparation, it can sometimes not go quite as you're planning, you then left with 1 university left over. So that's a pretty high risk strategy, really. Even though, you know, straight nines at GCSE, that's great. ASRAA predicted, that's great. Confident and relaxed under pressure, that's fine. But it's still, it's tempting fate, really. So what I'd probably want to do is decide which of UCL and Imperial I actually want to go to, and swap that out for basically a Ucat university. These are all also very competitive universities.
Yeah.
So you know, you are not only gearing it towards Bmat, but you're also gearing it towards the top end. And ultimately, you know, you don't need an offer from Cambridge and UCL and KCL and Imperial if you can only take one at the end. Whereas you're much better off having an offer.
Yeah, that's just a.
Yeah, it's just a big boast, but it doesn't get you that far.
We used to call it the ego application back in my day. If you got 4 offers, yes, as Will says, I agree with. I think UCL and Imperial, you choose one of them. The other thing to say here is actually King's is notorious for essentially rejecting students without very, very high Ucat scores. Generally, we advise anyone who hasn't got at least a Ucat score of 725 don't even bother with King's. There are exceptions, of course, depends on your profile, personal statement, and so on. But King's tends to be notorious. Now, you might look at their website, and their website may say, actually, last year we interviewed students who had a Ucat score of at least 680. Now, first thing, remember that that's just in King's and pretty much every other medical school will the scores and the cutoffs will change year on year. So it's important you not just look at a 1-year trend, but look at a 3 to 5 year trend to see what's been going on. And actually, if you do that for King's, you actually see that generally UCAT scores at interview students that tend to increase year after year. So it is really important that you pick your choices. So I think Will here, I agree with you. Assuming the student's got a decent UCAT, probably a safety university somewhere, kind of, you know, wherever that would be, would be kind of ideal.
And if the UCAT's no good, then you sort of pull out King's and definitely put in somewhere like Cardiff, which is one of those medical schools which really doesn't look at the Ucat for most applicants. They really care more about the GCSEs, which is where this candidate has done quite well.
Yeah, another one that might be quite good here is it's also Birmingham. So Birmingham value GCSEs quite highly. The other cool thing about Birmingham is you can actually use their online calculator, and it kind of shows you your chances of getting in. And obviously, they also use things like contextual information. So your postcode, you can actually I was doing this the other day. You can mess about with your postcode to see how your chances change depending on where you live as well. Okay. So how about? Yeah, we've got a second one. So this person's taking biology, physics, maths, and English. So despite our amazing advice, they've opted to do 4 A levels instead of 3.
And no chemistry.
And no chemistry. Well, let's give them chemistry, because I think otherwise it's
complicated things, doesn't it?
Let's swap out their maths for chemistry, because otherwise it's a very short discussion of don't apply. So they're doing biology, physics, chemistry, and English. Shy in person, can be anxious at familiar situations. Mostly A's, some 8s at GCSE, predicted AABB. What do you think? Oxford, Brighton, Manchester, Keele.
So I think obviously this student has quite high ambitions, and I'd need to have a serious conversation with them about Oxford. If Oxford is genuinely what they want to achieve, then what they need to do is actually, well, if that is all they will take, then they should take a year, get straight A stars in their A levels, and then apply with that rather than with the 7s and some 8s. Because, you know, talking about those average GCSEs, they're going to be right at the bottom of the pile. With those predicted grades, they're not looking good. You know, you have to be doing something incredibly dramatic in the BMAT to even stand a chance of being the worst of the ones that they're interviewing. So realistically, I don't think Oxford is a strong application right now. So I would, you know, swap that out for a less competitive university, one which cares less about the GCSEs. I suppose that the shy in person, obviously makes things a bit tricky. It might be that you want to go for a university which sort of puts a lot of emphasis on the tests, but naturally you're going to have to interview regardless of where you go, and so that is going to be something that you have to spend a lot of time working on for this student. So I'd be tempted to, have we got anything else on this into the UCAT? Yeah, I'd be tempted to keep Brighton in. You know, it's good to have, we still want to have that UCAT BMAT mix, but you might go for 3 UCAT, 1 BMAT in the example, just because the BMAT universities, most of them are quite competitive.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing I think I would probably advise the students, drop English. And just get that B up to an A, because that's just going to open up so many more options. I'm not a Philistine, but I think it's important that they, you know, whichever A level they drop, they need to present 3 A's. Thoughts on Leeds, Will? Leeds is a BMAT uni.
It's interesting. I think, broadly speaking, the competition for Leeds is slightly lower than for Brighton. So that might actually be a safer option. Again, it's, you know, I suppose one of the things that we don't have in these examples is what kind of scores they've been getting in their tests, because you know, that does make quite a big difference, for example, in their sort of practice tests that they've been trying. I don't know if for everyone else Rohan has paused, or if I'm just the only one that's paused. Do let us know in the chat. I might be speaking to myself. No, he's frozen. Am I frozen? Okay, fantastic. Just me then. Hopefully Rohan is able to join us back. Thank you very much for your assistance, everyone in the chat. I will send Rohan a message to let him know that he's been frozen. It might be that he has to leave and come back, which is exactly what's happened. But he also left with the presentation. So thank you very much, everyone who's still letting me know that you can hear me. This sometimes happens. We're pretty good at our tech these days, but not always. What I'll do while Rohan's sorting himself out, I'm going to spend some time going through your questions. So we've got some interesting ones. So someone has asked, for Oxbridge, must you have BMAT results before October 15th, or simply sit the test before October 15th? This is a really good question, actually, and there are a few interesting points to talk about. So firstly, you won't know your BMAT results before October 15th. Actually, I mentioned this a little bit. You have to make your applications blind to what your BMAT grade would be. That's pretty, you know, pretty worrying for some students. In previous years, what you would do is there are normally a few sittings of the BMAT, and very often students will sit it in September. Every university in the UK will accept that sitting except for Oxford. So for Oxford, you always had to sit it in sort of October, November after you've made your application. For the others, you could sit it before, but the earlier sittings have been gotten rid of. They were gotten rid of last year and this year due to COVID. Theoretically, they'll come back, but that hasn't been sort of discussed too much by the BMAT, I suppose, like governing organization. I have been told that Rohan is back with us, and I need to let him be a panelist. Let me find him. Here we are. Promote to panelist, should be with us soon. So yeah, so you don't know your BMAT score. This is why it's important to at least have done a couple practice papers before you make that application, to have a sense of which BMAT universities you might be aiming for, how many, and whether or not, you know, it's a sensible choice at all if your UCAT is significantly stronger than your BMAT could ever be. What will also happen is, so you'll sit your BMAT early November. You won't get your results until, usually it's the last week of November. Now, hopefully some of you know this, but Oxford and Cambridge interview in the first couple of weeks of December. So you'll probably find out your BMAT results a matter of days before you know whether or not you've got an interview. So some people will say to us, well, look, we've got lots on this year. What we'll do is we'll sit the UCAT, get the grade, sit the Bmat, get the grade, and then think about interviews. But actually, you give yourself very, very little time if you're going to do that. Rohan, are you back with us? Do I need to allow you to do?
I am back here. You just need to enable my video and we can crack on again.
Let me see how I can do that. Give that a go.
Okay, marvelous. Thanks, Will. Back from the back from dead.
While we lost you, I just went through one of the questions on the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, apologies everyone. I've recently moved house and it's internet's still a struggle at times. So I think we were just finishing up on this little example here. Well, so I was just saying, sometimes inevitably people at the end of this will say, which university should I apply to? And you can hopefully start seeing that we normally need to ask about 10 to 15 questions in order to really get a sense of which medical schools are appropriate. So if we do say, please book in a slot with us, it's not because we're being evasive. It is because we don't want to give you the wrong advice based on which medical schools you apply to, because it is a life-changing decision ultimately. So based on that, I think, you've already talked about Oxford versus other universities. Well, what about, if we ignore the kind of this profile in general, but we just talk about Oxford versus Cambridge, because that tends to be quite a common one. Yeah. Particularly for medicine, the kind of students are often asked, particularly when they're just about to apply and they say, I'm not sure which one should I go for. Yeah. With this student, it's a very clear answer here is, assuming they have the A-level grades, if they don't have the GCSEs appropriate, then the GCSEs here would definitely point them, or should point them towards Cambridge rather than Oxford. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. So the reason for this is basically Oxford across their subjects normally interview about 20 to 40% of the people applying. For medicine, I think it's about 25% of the people who make an application will actually be asked to interview, around 25-30. Cambridge, on the other hand, interview between 70 and 90% of their candidates. So if you're in the bottom 50% of your application year, you probably still get an interview. You have to be in the bottom 10% to not get an interview. Whereas for Oxford, if you're in the bottom 50%, you're not getting an interview for medicine. If you're in the bottom 75%, you're probably not getting an interview. So obviously this student with these kind of GCSEs, they're going to be near the bottom, if not right at the bottom, for an Oxbridge medical candidate. And if you consider that pie chart, normally 30% of that space is taken up by the interview. But before the interview, that space is shared effectively between the GCSEs and the test. So you know that in the GCSEs, you're right at the bottom. You've got the least weighting of everyone pretty much applying. And so your test is going to have to be absolutely phenomenal to even just start making up for that. Whereas at Cambridge, you'll get to interview, provided your test isn't horrendous. And then you've got an interview as well to be able to sort of build up the value of you as a student. So certainly if you're sat there and you're thinking, wow, 10.2 GCSEs at A star, that's pretty good. That's quite a way away from what I've got. Then Cambridge is certainly a more sensible decision, because you will get further in the application process.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, my 2-second summary of the longer.
Very. I always ramble with these things.
I was going to say you're eloquently detailed. Yeah.
Thank you.
If you have terrible GCSEs, go for Cambridge. If you have good GCSEs, go to Oxford. If your terrible GCSEs are still less than mostly A stars, and probably Oxford isn't a good fit for you. Okay. Well, I get almost time to move on, but I'm sure we'll get some of these questions about, I've got a low UCAT score, what should I do?
Yeah.
What are the options? One option is obviously take the Bmat.
Yeah.
What if someone says, actually, I don't want to go to Oxbridge, I don't want to go to London, or what then?
Or Leeds or Brighton.
Well, I guess Leeds and Brighton is, the first thing what happens is people think Bmat is just for Oxbridge and London. Yeah. So that's the first thing, I suppose, is Brighton and Leeds, right?
Yeah. So you're right. People think I'm not going to go to the Bmat because I'm not applying to those competitive universities. Now, there's a misunderstanding there. Every medical school is very competitive. But if you're worried about those sort of very academic ones, then yeah, Leeds or Brighton. The other
5 years ago, there used to be, do you know what the 5 years ago what the most competitive medical school was to get into? Purely on numbers. I don't know if you'll know this actually.
Potentially Birmingham.
So yeah, Birmingham was actually very high up there, but it was actually Southampton, and it was for a very obscure reason, which was unlike every other medical school in the country, Southampton didn't do an interview, and they obviously have changed that quite significantly. So you had this crazy scenario where Southampton they had 20 applicants per place, compared to an Oxford which only had somewhere between 5 and 8. So people were actually scared of applying to Southampton more than they were some of the other medical schools. So yeah, again, the moral of that story is please don't look into statistics a little bit too much, because the quality of applicants at some of the better universities will be significantly higher than some of those, the lower end.
Yeah, that sample is very self-selecting, the Oxbridge applicant sample. But yeah, Leeds, Brighton, certainly those are definitely good other opportunities to explore. Also, my example of Cardiff, if your Ucat is very low, evaluate your GCSEs and see what we can do there. But there's nuances even within a bad Ucat score. Because there are sometimes they evaluate the individual sections more, sometimes they evaluate the overall score. And that's what gives you your marks, which are then compiled into your overall application. So there may even be within medical schools which evaluate the Ucat at the same weight. It could be that the way that they do it even, favorably looks on your application favorably. There are some that will put a fair amount of weighting on getting a band 1 on the SJT. There are some that the SJT doesn't matter at all, and all they say is don't get a band 4, and then band 4 might be a sort of restricting threshold. So there's even within I've got a low Ucat, there are some things to look into on that front.
Yeah, so if you're applying to Edinburgh and you have a band 1, then Edinburgh is a very, very good shout, because they value band 1s much more. Whereas if you have a band 4, then please avoid Edinburgh, for example. So there are, as Will said, there are lots of these nuances, both for the Ucat and the Bmat. The important thing is we won't have time to be able to cover every single one, otherwise it just turns into a very long list.
Yeah.
The important thing is whichever universities you're interested in, obviously do your research in advance, and then come to us and say, look, here are the options I'm considering. We'll ask you lots more questions and be able to give you better advice based on that. Okay, right, enough on that.
Sorry, but just one last thing. Everyone might be saying, well, where do I get this information? And actually, pretty much every medical school will have it on their website somewhere, how they evaluate your application and what points they give where. So this is broadly pretty obtainable. It's then a matter of getting all that information and then evaluating where you stand.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so what about interviews? It's interesting, isn't it? So this tends to be some kind of a neglected topic, as it were, because people tend to leave it till it's too late. So, Will, lots of people may not even understand what an MMI is.
Yeah.
Walk them through that.
Yeah, so MMIs are used by the majority of the medical schools in the UK. Effectively, it will be a combination of a number of, as you've got here, stations. And each station will be a slightly different kind of scenario. So you might have a station where it's a bit more of like a classic interview for 5 minutes. And then right after that, you're into a role play, very often, breaking bad news to a family member of a patient. Then right after that, you're into a sort of work out this person's BMI. Then right after that, you're 5 minutes of potentially explaining what, why the BMI is used and the sort of public health implications of it, and perhaps some public health policy. So you are sort of shooting around from these different scenarios, one off to the other. They can be, each medical school will have different stations and will also have different numbers. So some medical schools might have fewer stations, but each station is longer. Some medical schools might have more stations, but each station is shorter. Ultimately, if you're very good at quickly changing what you're thinking about, then this is obviously what they're trying to test, because in a hospital setting, you're going from one thing to another, to another, to another. And you need to be able to show that, I suppose, that mental dexterity.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. Well, I actually don't have a sure way of doing that, summarizing that. So here's some common questions or examples of questions that have come up in the past. The whole point of MMIs compared to normal panel style interviews is that essentially it's a reset. And when you get into medical school, and if we have some doctors amongst us, they'll understand this. You have something called OSCEs, which are observed simulated clinical experience. Essentially, they are just MMIs, but in a clinical setting. So what the MMIs are designed to do is to assess, essentially assess applicants, but not just with the biases of a single interviewer. Sometimes you may not even have an interviewer at your station. It might just be a calculation station, for instance. So instead of having one or two people kind of firing question one after the other at an applicant and then making up their mind quite early on in the interview, MMIs are designed to remove the cognitive biases associated with having just one or two interviewers for a much longer period. So whilst they may feel like more of an interrogation, believe us when we say actually the process is made much more fair as a result of them. Will, any fun questions here you'd like to have a go at?
Well, I think I'm all right actually, but obviously you can sort of tell that they are sort of trying to evaluate lots of different things, and I think, you know, certainly what you were saying, Rohan, is important. You know, if you have one station which has gone badly, you need to have the resilience to just sort of forget it, get it out of your head, move on to the next one, and be good at it. And that's actually a really important thing to practice. I would, you know, be inclined to try and set up in my mock interviews a station which goes badly, and then working through it and seeing if it affects my other stations.
To a certain extent, we try and do that in our courses, because we purposefully tell our tutors to make them very hard, and inevitably one or two of them don't go well. And that is actually a very good experience for the kids as well, because it's important. They need to know they can move on. And essentially what I call is the unplug, switch on and move on kind of approaches, so that if you have a bad one, it doesn't mean that the whole interview is doomed. Actually, it's just one station out of many that's gone badly. The other kind of thing to kind of spotlight here, I mean, if you look at the fourth question, do you think nurses are important? The answer here is obviously yes, but actually this question can come up in different ways. So in my med school interview, I was asked about why I wanted to be a doctor, and again, you know, gave a reasonable response. And then the follow-up question was, okay, if you just like science, then why don't you, or if you just like helping people, why don't you become a nurse? And actually, there are very few things you can say to that without sounding like essentially you're insulting nurses. You have to be very careful with the wording, and unless you practice that, like I had, you can easily end up digging yourself a deeper hole. So, you know, when people say actually interview is just a conversation, I'll just turn up and give it a go, I kind of slowly kind of roll my eyes and have to then coach them about how, no, it's like an entrance exam, and like any exam, it needs and should be prepared for. So once you've done your tests, please start preparing for your interviews, because they are soft skills. Unless you've got significant practice in interviews, they take a serious amount of time to improve them. Yeah. Okay. So we're kind of coming towards the kind of culmination of all of this. We're going to go through a little bit about how we can help students. So obviously we've been talking a lot about the kind of background as to how students can go about improving their application. Well, if someone wants to come on board with us, obviously there's quite a bit we can do for them, but can you just take me through the kind of main summary of how we work with students?
Yeah. So obviously the first thing to say is we'll speak with you. We do not support students without having spoken with them first and worked out exactly what they need, but we have a pretty reliable approach to the process, which we know with the right kind of students will make an enormous difference. And there are basically four main parts to it. We don't just do one thing. We want to approach these hard problems from a number of different angles. So one-to-one tutoring with tutors who have been through the process themselves and helped others through it as well. So they know what you're going through and they know how to get through it. Lots of, I'll talk a bit more about it in a second. Lots of materials and resources. You know, a tutor is not a substitute for practice. You still need to be doing a lot of that. Weekly medical classes. So obviously wider reading is important, but we want to make sure that you are exploring topics which, you know, the person who interviews after you won't have been doing. We are pushing you above what you're learning at school and really into the kind of level that these universities can be interested in. And then finally, we wrap everything up with intensive courses near the end of the year, just a few weeks before each of these things actually happen, so that you can consolidate all that you've done and really focus and really make sure that you walk into the real thing. So let's talk about each one of those briefly. The tuition is a really, really important part of it. You know, it's like we were saying earlier, it's very easy to fall into traps when you're preparing for something. It's very easy to not focus on the things that you need to be focusing on. And it's very easy to get stuck, ultimately. These aren't easy tests. It's not always very apparent why you got something wrong and why the right answer was right. And having someone there to effectively sort of guide you and support you with it is really, really important. But they're, you know, they won't be taking the test for you. They're not going to be sort of spoon feeding you. They're going to expect you to be very mature, very independently driven, and to work very hard. So they'll be setting you homework and tasks, and they'll expect you to do it all and make sure that you're making the most of it. You know, we expect our students to take this as seriously as we do at the end of the day. And naturally, it's very difficult, particularly for things like the interview, to prepare on your own. I imagine Rohan will have done some interviews in the mirror, but
I did, yeah. How did you know?
I just knew. I could just tell.
It is very hard to talk to a mirror. So.
Yeah. I knew you wouldn't have given a single avenue of preparation amiss. But yeah, you know, you need someone there who's able to ask the questions where the tutor would ask the questions, you know, delve deeper into the things that the tutor would delve deeper into. And, you know, whilst, you know, a mirror can't do it, mum and dad might do their best. Even a biology teacher at school might give it a good go. But actually, unless they've done an MMI, unless they've done an Oxbridge interview, it's very difficult to really know what they're like. And I think we've got the next slide is a lesson report.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is one of the reports from actually a medical interview, and this is what you get at the end of each of your tutorial sessions. So if it's just an ordinary tutorial about personal statement or the BMAT, then you know you get lots of feedback about that. But if it's a mock interview, each of our mock interviews you do with a new tutor. So you know it's not Stephanie that you've been working with for a couple of months and gotten to know. It's a brand new person, you don't recognize them. New voice, new demeanor, all those kind of things, because of course your interviewer, you won't have met them before. And crucially, you know, you've got a lot of ideas of the things to be working on after that tutorial and the things that you can improve on. What we don't expect our students to sort of come out of a tutorial and then just stop thinking about it. We expect them to carry on working on things and keep improving in their own time, and then of course accelerate through with their tutor next time.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the resources, I think that the main thing I want to stress here is essentially we are essentially a prep school for students working towards applying to medical school. So even though we do a lot of tutoring, actually we're not really a tutoring agency. We essentially provide a curriculum, and we basically expect our students to stick to that curriculum. So we'll tell them in September week 2, here are the things you should be doing, here are the 3 things you should be doing this week, and here's the curriculum and syllabus that you need to follow. And what we do is we provide them all the resource materials. So they get access to all of our textbooks. You've probably seen a few of them already. They're available on Amazon. Lots and lots of questions on our admissions test, lots of videos. Essentially, it's all the resource and materials that they need in order to put in a winning application. And we really don't worry about kind of giving you excessive levels of detail of exactly what this includes, because frankly, most of you would get very, very bored of it. And for the minority of you who would be interested in it, it's available on our website in far more eloquent and succinct terms than either Will or I can do it right now. Yeah. So if you would like to know how many papers for the Bmat Section 2 we provide access to, then all of that is available on our website. Suffice to say, it's essentially the program works, it delivers results, and we give pretty much every resource out there available to our students because we know how important that side of things is. So here's a very quick summary of our little portal. And you can see actually there's increasing amounts that get added to it. So throughout the year, we've been adding more and more features to this. So the prep portal on the far left actually has revision notes, practice questions, simulated exams. This way you can take all past papers. There's video solutions to them as well. In the academy is where we've got recordings of our courses, both online and pre-recorded courses. So for example, our Ucat course, it's actually happening right now, Will. That's taking place today, and students will be able to access that in the portal as well from the day after it's finished. And obviously the seminars, which hopefully, yes, I'm trying to do right.
Yes, so the enrichment seminars, they're sort of hugely influential in terms of helping our students grapple with advanced topics, but also get into their comfort zone, asking questions, and discussing these things. You know, for a lot of people, they go to an Oxbridge interview and it's unlike anything they've ever done before. And that can be quite an unsettling thing. That can really knock you off and, you know, mean that you're not quite ready to really perform as best as you can. So what we do is we have our students every Sunday afternoon, they are discussing an advanced medical topic. So it might be, you know, they spend a lot of time talking about different medical technologies like insulin and IVF. They might talk about sort of more ethical discussions like resource allocation and, you know, using QALYs. So that there's a huge range of different things that they talk about. And the idea, again, is not only to help you build content, help you build areas that you understand and are interested in, but also to mean that you can walk into that interview pretty comfortable, knowing that you've been doing something like this every week for the last 3, 6, 9 months, however long it is. And I think we have a brief clip from actually our 2 medical. Yes, so this is from, I think, our very first enrichment seminar last year. And they effectively explain why they think it's a good idea.
It's supposed to be 24. It's supposed to guide you throughout your application with your wider reading. So everyone knows that you have to do wider reading to support your medical application, to sort of demonstrate that you have an insight into medicine. But the other thing that these enrichment supervisions will do is supposed to help you increase your confidence in discussing these different aspects of your wider reading, because that's what you're going to be asked to do at interview. So I think the best place to start building up your confidence is probably on here and talking in this group.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to mention here is these do take place every Sunday at 2 p.m. Now we expect our students to have a social life or have a life just outside applying to med school, even though that is quite a big chunk. So they are available and recorded. There is pre-reading and there is follow-up reading as well. And Will, you mentioned obviously Oxbridge, you know, obviously look for these things, but even standard medical school. So when I applied to King's, for instance, they asked me what reading I'd done, and then we ended up talking about statins, and I was found woefully short what I probably should have known at that time. I wasn't when it happened to my Cambridge interview, but the whole point is the extra reading is really important. And if people and students attend these and do the work they're meant to, then they have a significant competitive advantage, not just for their interview, but also the Bmat essay, because a lot of these topics are very relevant. We talk a lot about ethics, for instance, as well. Okay, I think the final bit is the intensive courses.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, these sort of don't take too much to explain. Ultimately, a few weeks before your Bmat, we get you, as well as all our other Bmat students, break you down into small class groups, usually about sort of 6 of you, each with to 1 tutor, and work through every part of that test. What we want to make sure is that it's effectively just a day of ticking boxes. You going through saying, we've gone through section 1, I was fantastic, I aced it. We've gone through section 2, I was fantastic, I aced it, my essay was fantastic. You come out of that day knowing you've done the work that you needed to. In the chance that you come out and you actually think, oh, actually, section 1 was fantastic, section 3 was fantastic, section 2, couple of my peers in my group actually were a bit quicker than me, then you know, okay, I've got 2 weeks now to just polish that off. So these intensive courses are a really important part of summarizing and being the last push for the preparation. And we do them for the interviews, for the tests, for the personal statements, you know, all these key things that are coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. It essentially allows us to make sure that students are all up to the same level that we expect them to be. Now, in terms of the whole point of doing this, well, we'll come on to that in a sec, but the thing to mention is this is our portal, and this holds everything together. So you can see all the library of books, seminars, the courses, the lesson reports, all of them is hosted on our online portal, which you get access to upon enrolling. So what's the point of doing this? Well, you don't do 30, 50, 100 hours of Bmat Ucat prep in order to just be successful, you know, because you like it. You do it because essentially it works. So students who follow our curriculum, follow our syllabus, we got just under 2/3 of them into Oxbridge last year for med school, compared to the national average about 20%. And for medicine, actually, we do even better. So the average medical success rate tends to be about 12 to 20%, depending on the medical school. Last year, we got just under 3 courses. So what we do does work, but it is a significant investment, both in students' time and parents' money. So we have to make sure there's a good fit for both sides of the result. We'll skip past this one. Actually, no, I think, well, the thing that I like to point out here is, I know this is all for Oxford, but similar patterns are seen across medical schools as well, which is that schools are very good at preparing their kids, but this actually shows the top 50, 25 schools in the country for Oxford applicants. And you can see even here, most top schools only average around 20 to 30%. In fact, the average of those 25 schools is about 25%. Then you compare that to our 61%, we do come out on top, and it's not because, you know, they're bad schools by any stretch, it's just they aren't as focused on it. So the way I tend to explain what we do is we're an adjunct to, essentially we're an adjunct to a prep school. So it's a little school that your child goes to after school, and we teach them everything they need to know in order to get them an offer for medical school, and then we pass them back to you in April 2022, hopefully with not just one but multiple offers. So we've kind of been talking a lot about kind of what we have to offer. I think it's also important to say that we won't work with everyone. We have a very specific type of student that we will work with, and that attitude is far more important than anything else that we see on paper. Obviously, you need certain grades, but just because you have straight A levels and straight GCSEs doesn't necessarily mean that we'll accept you to enroll onto our programs.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we just accept everyone?
Good question.
It'd make our shareholders happy.
Yeah, and you know, I think ultimately most people would say would have that kind of approach. It wouldn't make sense to most people. But what we do at UniAdmissions is we get people offers, or you know, we help people achieve fantastic things. If we know that this student isn't going to achieve fantastic things because they're not going to be bothered, then it wastes a lot of time on our end. It makes a mess of our success stats. And ultimately, you know, we end up with parents at the end of the year very upset because they've enrolled them onto a program which was meant to help, and the kid didn't show up to anything.
Yeah.
You know, ultimately, I make recommendations for students that I believe in, that I know this program can help. And if I know that this program isn't going to make a difference because you're not going to do it, then it's not worth our time, really.
Yeah. Yeah, we are very protective of our success rates, because next year when we're doing this, we want to say we got 90% of our kids in instead of 70%, for example. And as Will mentioned, we have a student honor code. So every student that enrolls onto us, even though we make sure that we think they're a good fit, every now and then, shock horror, we can be wrong. So we kind of enforce it by essentially every student that comes on board with us has to sign an honor code. It makes students accountable for their own learning, ensures that, you know, they make do with all the resources and actually utilize them. They turn up to the lessons on time, having prepared, they do their homework, they respond to their teachers when they're instructed to do so. So we're not chasing them. It's all the things you'd expect if you were going to a school, all very standard stuff, but it ensures that they're accountable for it. So, Will, have you managed to get yourself a review on Trustpilot yet?
I haven't checked recently. I don't think so.
Okay.
Matt likes to bring up the fact that no one said anything nice about me yet. But despite him teasing me about it every week, no one's felt altruistic enough to make a change. But we'll see.
Well,
we'll see.
Yeah, audience, if you're interested in propping up Will and making his weekend, then please do leave us a review on Trustpilot, or leave Will a review and specifically mention his name. He'll greatly appreciate it.
I'll be very happy.
And we'll stop mocking him every open day.
I think the key thing to say with this is, some students we help for 2 years with a massive program. Some students we just spend 20 minutes on the phone giving them advice. Regardless of how much you interact with us, whatever feedback you have is helpful. If the feedback is that I was not very good today, then actually that's still very helpful. And we always integrate that into what we do, what we develop, and how we try to improve.
If that is your feedback, I'll have to buy Will a new pillow so that he can cry into it tonight.
Yeah, I'm not sure my self-esteem can take it.
Yes, but if you are wondering on what buy and how we work, obviously you don't have to take it from us. There are lots of reviews available online on Trustpilot in particular. Okay, and the final thing to mention on this note is we're not just all about the money. So actually, please do reach out to us, even if you think you can't. Don't let money be a big factor to you, because if you don't have the financial means to be able to enroll onto our programs, we will offer them to you for free. So last year we helped just under 100 students. This year we're aiming for 250. I think we're already halfway there. And we have spaces for a lot more. So please don't let money be an issue when choosing to whether you speak to us or not. Okay, and a little shameless plug here, which is if you would like more of me and Will, and you can't wait until next Saturday, then we do have a podcast. It's called the Two Blues Podcast, and we talk about generally Oxbridge and medical school topics, but we do kind of foray into the uncharted waters of zombie-proofing your house, as well as other unusual topics. So if you like more of this and want more of it, then tune in. It's on Spotify and all general podcasting mediums.
If you haven't noticed, Rohan and my conversations can become quite tangential. So this podcast is effectively our effort to try and stay on topic, but we do pretty badly each time.
Yeah, I would say we're getting better, except no.
And then 30 minutes later, we haven't addressed what we said we'd address.
Okay, so this brings us on to our final bit. We're going to start taking Q&As now. So Will, I lost some of our earlier questions when my net cut out, so you'll have to clear those off.
Okay.
But for those of you kind of who perhaps we say, actually, it's better you help us, you should speak to us directly. This little video shows you how to do that. So it's really simple. You just go onto the UniAdmissions website, so uniadmissions.co.uk, fill in a couple of details, and one of our consulting team, or if you're lucky, even me or will give you a ring to kind of go through things in a bit more detail with you and just see how we can help you.
Yeah.
That initial consult is completely for free, and from there onwards we can have a discussion about whether you'd be a good fit for the foundation or our programs and so on. So please do book in a slot with us, and now we're going to start going through Q&A. So Will,
I'll kick things off. I've got someone's asked, as an international student, which medical school is statistically more likely to accept you, Oxford or Cambridge? And we didn't really talk too much about international applicants, but there's an added complication for them, and that is that the GMC, the General Medical Council, has a limit on the number of students that each university can actually accept internationally. So for Oxford, it's 14, for Cambridge, it's 21. What this means is the acceptance rates are phenomenally low, normally between 2 and 4%, depending on the university. Purely based on number of applicants to places, that Oxford is harder. But of course, there are other things which, you're looking at population data there rather than individual data. It might be that you are statistically a stronger Oxford candidate, even though the population is more suited to Cambridge. So that's always worth bearing in mind. But a more general point for internationals is you need to do very, very, very well on your admissions tests because of how competitive it is.
Yeah, international medics are very rare and vanishingly rare because it is just fiendishly competitive.
Yeah.
So if you are applying, you do need to be creme de la creme in order to stand any chance at all. Okay. How many months before should you be preparing for the Bmat? Well, that's an interesting question. It's a bit like an investing question. So sometimes people say, well, when should I start investing? Well, the first answer and the best answer is 10 years ago is when you should have started. The second best time is now. Now, it's probably a similar thing. I wouldn't say you should have started preparing for your Bmat 10 years ago. It's a bit far-fetched. But generally, what we find is, depending on what your background is, if you dropped physics or not, depends on how strong you are at biology, chemistry, maths, critical thinking. If you did that as an AS, generally, in most cases, 3 to 6 months tends to be enough, presuming that you have a solid foundation. That doesn't necessarily mean 10 hours a day on the Bmat. Realistically, if you're doing that level of intensive preparation, it's not really, you probably shouldn't ever have to do that level of intensive preparation unless you're in the final 1 or 2 weeks. So generally months rather than weeks, but of course anything is better than nothing. And again, it will depend on your background and baseline to start with.
Yeah. I've got someone has said, any specific advice for international applicants? Just thought I'd reiterate, your test scores need to be fantastic. You need to be very sensible with your applications, and you definitely need to be sitting UCAT and Bmat. Things are made so difficult for you. You really don't want to be giving yourself more trouble. So you need to be taking every opportunity you can effectively. Yara has asked, would having an AS be useful in any way? The short answer is basically no.
Not really, unfortunately.
People don't sit ASs really that much anymore. No. It's sort of, I mean, it's fine, but they're not going to pay too much attention to it.
Yeah, I think what you said is great. It is just fine. It's not going to help or hinder. It's just, it exists. Yeah. I suppose if you did an AS in physics, then it would help you with the Bmat, but that'd probably be it. But I don't think it's going to help you make or break your offer.
Yeah. Okay. Someone's asked, what does 10.2 GCSEs mean? What it means is it's an average. So if you have an average of 11 and 10, that's 10.5. You can't get half a GCSE, but when you average across, a large population, you can end up with that. So, 10.2 A stars at GCSE is pretty good. It's pretty strong, and certainly something to be aware of when you're making an application.
They used to do these things called BTECs a long time ago. I think they still run now. But with those, if you got a BTEC, it was actually worth 4.5 GCSEs. That was the only way you could get half a GCSE.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Back in the day, you could do it with the cadets force, actually, the CCF. If anyone here is a cadet, then
I was a cadet. I almost did a BTEC through that. Yeah.
All right. Well, he would have ended up with an
extra half GCSE. Someone has said, so there have been quite a few with like all your sort of grades and your UCAT score. This is sort of what Rohan was saying earlier. Ultimately, what we want to do with the Q&A is give as much value to as many people as possible, and sort of giving individual answers is we found not always the best way to do it. If you are very worried about your medical school choices or your application so far, then you're actually better off having a chat with us, and it's likely that we'll ask you quite a few more things. Someone's asked a very interesting question saying, can I get admission to a medical school with a high score in the Ucats? And actually, by and large, that's what they're looking for. It will very, very certainly help you if you've got a high UCAT score.
We've got an interesting one here. UCAT band 1, but only scored 2200, so that's 550. Should I abandon UCAT medical schools? My GCSEs are average. Oh, well, firstly, all hope is not lost. Don't be so hard on yourself. As we mentioned, there are several universities which will still consider you. We've got lots of data on this on our website. But as Will mentioned, places like Cardiff, for instance, Exeter are good places to start.
The Cardiff probably not if the GCSEs are average.
Ah, yes. Okay.
I'd say probably BMAT.
I suppose it depends what average means, right? As well, if you mean kind of middling Bs and Cs, or sixes and fives, and yes, you're going to struggle. Yes, BMAT would be an option. Again, this is why we need to have a lot more information about you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
We've got one by Nassim Patel. Who can I speak to at UniAdmissions regarding choice of medical school? I've got an excellent Ucat, but an SJT of 3, band 3. So again, the best thing is to book a consult, and we'll get in touch with you accordingly, because we're not going to be able to kind of go through the 50 people who are attending this. We're not going to be able to go through each and every single one of your applications in detail. Well, we can, but we'll be here until dinner time, and I'm sure you all want to get dinner.
I've just read one. So someone has said, I've attended several online info sessions by and about Oxford, and none, as you have, has suggested that the personal statement for medical applicants is de-emphasised. Is this something Oxford will confirm if asked, or is this strategic insight you've drawn based on your admissions experience? It's interesting if they'd confirm it if asked. Probably. What we do, we get a lot of sort of feedback analysis from students who come to us second time around. So you know, a re-applicant who comes to us and they have full feedback, and most of the time there's a really clear definitively that the personal statement is very unimportant. So normally what they have is a grading system of most important to least important, and most important is test, GCSEs, projected grades. Middle important, this is for selecting for interview, middle important, school reference. Least important, personal statements, AS grades. So we know that pretty definitively. Exactly, you know, exactly that the personal statement has a 8% weighting or anything like that. That is a bit more of, I suppose, setting up some guidelines. So if you said, you know, is the application going to be 10%, my personal statement, my school reference, they probably wouldn't say, yeah, that's exactly how we do it. But that's a bit of a combination of the information we know plus the data that we see. And that's basically how we decide on everything. It's a combination of what we hear directly from Oxford, Cambridge, and also what the data that we gather.
Yeah, the other thing to mention here, Will, is that the whole admissions process may, for Oxford and Cambridge in particular, may look like it's a centralized, unified process, but actually each college has its own algorithm. So for example, my old college would value the BMAT instead of 30%, they would value it 50%. And depending on the admissions officer and who change, and you know, the staff, that algorithm can change pretty much on an annual basis, depending on the cohorts that they get. So Oxford would never confirm nor deny that. Essentially, they would kind of give a general overview, as Will said, in that table, which we already have access to. But they won't ever say, this is worth 3%, this is worth 5%, because next year it may change, and it would just be too much work for them to declare that.
Rohan, there have been a couple questions about EPQs. What's your opinion on EPQs?
Yeah, I think they tend to be kind of, I think they're good to kind of help students explore their subjects. But again, in terms of moving the needle, they don't really move the needle when it comes to med school applications. It's similar to AS. I don't know if you've had any different experience as well.
So broadly, what I see is the difference. The process of having done an EPQ is helpful, but actually the EPQ like grade doesn't necessarily matter. So the fact that you put in the time and the effort to do it, and you've learned stuff, and you're then potentially able to talk about on personal statement and interviews, that's something which is helpful. But you know, they're not going to say, well, this person had a better BMAT, but this person got a top grade in their EPQ.
Correct. Yeah, it's like sometimes people say to us, I need 500 Ucats points, or I've got grade 8 drums. Is that going to help me because I've got an extra 80 Ucats points? Well, the answer is you picked up hopefully some transferable skills by mastering something at a high level. Absolute terms, no, but in terms of relative terms, it probably help you kind of, you know, there'll be a little bit of skills that you can transfer into other areas of your application, which may help. But it is quite loose and undefined. Yeah. We've got a simple one here. If you score high in the Bmat Ucat in year 12, can this be used for 2023 entry? If only, that'd be wonderful. But unfortunately, your test results are only valid for 1 year.
If you could, you'd sort of start sealing it from year 8, wouldn't you? And hope that you get one good one.
The American system is essentially what they do.
And someone was asking about GCSE grades and sort of converting them into the A-star system. Now, I think we talk about A-stars because when Rohan and I sat our GCSEs, that's how they were graded, and that's what we understand. I don't think they sort of convert them back. I think they have an understanding of a 9 and an 8. I mean, yeah, 9 and 8 is an A-star, that's how we understand them, but I think they're just sort of evaluated on their own. One thing that we do see is that 9s and 8s are broadly seen as the same for the purposes of selecting for interviews.
Yeah.
So someone with 5 8s and 2 9s is the same as someone with 5 9s and 2 8s.
Yeah, absolutely. And that pretty much applies to almost every medical school. There are 1 or 2 notable exceptions, which this year they were meant to start distinguishing 9 and 8s. Whether they'll actually go on to do so remains to be seen, because of what happened last year with kind of essentially people getting the grades they were predicted. So it may not actually come into force until next year, potentially. Okay, is 7 weeks enough time to prepare for Bmat score 664A? Well, again, it depends on what you're scoring now. If you're scoring 7s, then yes. If you're scoring 3s, then, well, you've got a lot of work ahead of you. Realistically, it just depends on a whole host of factors, how many papers you've done, whether you've done physics, what your chemistry background is, and so on and so on. So we can't really answer that. Generally, 7 weeks to 10 hours a day, yes, probably. 7 weeks for an hour a week, no, it won't be. So again, it's all about contextualizing these things.
Yeah, I was going to say it's actually a huge metric of actually how much you can do in those 7 weeks. The reason why we like to start with months in pocket to start preparing for something like this is so that you can do a few hours a week, working away on it consistently over time, gradually improving. It's the best way to learn something. It's the best way to develop a skill. And it means that it doesn't interfere with everything else that you've got going on. It means that you don't have to drop your trips. I know there was someone last year that I spoke with who was meant to be finishing off their Gold DOV with a weekend expedition, couldn't do it because they had left their BMAT preparation too late. So, starting early is always much more sensible.
Esrael, when should we aim to sign up to your program for 2023 entry? Well, pretty much we've got 2 main entry points. One is September this year, and I suppose the next logical point would be January next year. So really, the best thing to do is to kind of speak to one of us. We'll be able to kind of assess your child and really take things from there.
Yeah. It depends a lot on the students.
Yeah.
If the student's very engaged and very hardworking, then there's a lot we can do with these next few months.
Yeah.
Like we've said, some of our students start from year 10, and we're helping them develop academic skills through their subject. Yeah,
and the important thing to say is the price doesn't change whenever you come to us. So generally, the earlier you come to us, the more, we want there to be an incentive for students to come to us early rather than later, because that's when we can make the biggest differences. Great. Okay.
There are a couple have been asking about if your tests are good, but your interviews let you down, which is a really, really good question, actually. So ultimately, you're always going to be evaluated as a whole. It's not like you get through one stage and now you're only evaluated in that stage to get through to the next stage. They only look at that stage. So they will be looking at your interview performance alongside your tests and your grades still. But of course, we know that the interviews is an important part. And so if you have a very, very poor interview performance, particularly given that medicine is such a in-person skill, it's possible that that could be enough to undo what had otherwise been a very strong application so far. And so, of course, it's very important not to rest on your laurels, just like how if you've got flawless grades, a very bad test performance can undo that application. So really the application isn't over until you've got your offer. you really need to make sure that you're still doing well across the board. Have we got, will we pick out one more each, Rohan?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, it's been going on for a while, hasn't it?
It has. We normally wrap these things off at 3:30, but because there's lots of questions and because the discussion was quite long, we've carried on a little bit.
Okay, well, you can pick your one. I'm
Yeah.
just looking through now.
Okay, so someone's asked a question about further maths. So they said, if you take maths at A level in year 12 and further maths in year 13, is this counted as 3 or 4 A levels? And will your A level in year 12 be taken into account? And could an offer be made on taking only, then presumably dropping another A level in your final year? So there's a couple of things there. Firstly, yeah, so if you do 3 A levels and then further maths, that's kind of seen as 4 A levels. And yes, your A level grade that you already have secured will absolutely be taken into account in the decision. However, if you're going to drop anything, I would normally recommend dropping further maths. For example, if you've got maths, chemistry, biology, further maths, and you drop either biology or chemistry, then that's not necessarily a fantastically strong combination. So you're better off if you, as far as I know, you're better off dropping that further maths rather than dropping chemistry or biology. Rohan, would you say otherwise?
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, right, we're going to try and blitz through some of these just to give some quick fire answers.
Okay,
yeah, my son's predicted grades are AAA, chemistry, biology, maths, 2900 Ucats score. Which universities are better to apply to? So definitely consider universities like King's and Nottingham. More details can be found on our website. Is Imperial more competitive than UCL Medicine? It depends on the year you're looking at, which cohort. They're pretty much both very competitive. Depends on your background, if you're applying as an international, which A levels you have again. So again, booking a consult to discuss further. Which unis look for band 1 SJT? A list can be found on our website online. Again, 2800 UCAT, very academic scores. Which UCAT colleges should we consider? So it has come up, we really addressed that. There's a couple of questions about the University of Buckingham. So Buckingham was a private university. In terms of is it good or not, it's very hard to say. Very subjective answer. It's approved by the GMC, so you'll end up as a doctor, which is ultimately what matters. There's a few more about which UCAT scores. I've got X UCAT score and I've got Y UCAT score. What should I do? Where should I apply? Again, please book in a consult with us. We'll be able to kind of advise further. If a student has very high UCAT BMAT and did very badly in the interviews, they're given an offer. So as Will's mentioned, it depends on the medical school you're applying to. If you're offered an interview at Oxford, does that guarantee an interview for the college you applied to? If you applied to Cambridge, then yes. If you applied to Oxford, yes, and you'll have another interview at a random college. The only difference is if you applied for an open application. Okay, how are we doing? We're getting there. Would you recommend applying to, which unis would you recommend applying to based on poor GCSEs? That's really specialist. So again, please book in a consultation with us. How do you choose an Oxbridge College? We've got an open day coming up, which will hopefully allow you to do this in a couple of weeks' time. What's problem-based, case-based learning? Happy to go through that in a consult with you, but very, very briefly. Essentially, it's very different to the traditional format of learning sciences and then patient contact. So instead you work with, and given a problem, that you work together as a team. Do we help with US? We have helped 1 or 2 students, but we have a partner that we tend to pass students on to. So if you are interested in the US, please reach out to us first. There's a few questions on which Oxbridge colleges, so we'll leave those until the Oxbridge College talk. Will, is there anything else that catches your eye? Should we start wrapping up?
I think you covered quite a lot very quickly there.
We've got one on what's considered a good UCAT score. So anything above 800 is excellent, 700 above is good, 600 to 650 is okay, average, 650 to 700 is okay. Anything less than 600 is below average. Okay, so I think
that's it.
Yeah, I think there's a few more here, but largely we managed to get through most of it. It's quite a long one. I think the key thing when we're looking at medical schools is to be strategic, spread your risks, diversify risk, and be open to taking the BMAT. That's one of the biggest mistakes that students make. Will.
Yeah.
Great. Well, any last words of wisdom before we sign off?
I think I'm all out of words of wisdom for today.
Well, in that case, there's not much else to say apart from thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks,
Probably one of the longest overviews we've had, and hopefully see you all next week for another dose of Will's wisdom. Have a lovely weekend.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.